again illustrates the strong line of continuity, much as Carruthers feared. That should come as little surprise, given the unusual significance of Iraq in geopolitical and economic terms, though the scale of the catastrophe could hardly have been anticipated. Chapter 5. Supporting Evidence: The Middle East. Beyond declarations of leaders and the self-refuting case of Iraq, several additional bits of evidence have been adduced to justify the faith in the sincerity of the Messianic mission. The most important are Lebanon, Egypt's Kifaya Enough movement, and Palestine. Let us examine each in turn. The case of Lebanon can be dismissed unless the CIA decides to take credit for the bombing that killed Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, which set off the anti-Syrian demonstrations that have led to a complex but significant opening of the society. Though it is hardly credible, one can imagine why the story might have some resonance in Beirut. Perhaps the Lebanese have not consigned to oblivion the most horrendous car bombing in Beirut in 1985, a huge explosion killing 80 people and wounding 200, mostly women and girls, leaving the mosque exit where the bomb was placed. The attack, aimed at a Muslim cleric who escaped, was traced to the CIA and Saudi intelligence, apparently operating with British help. Accordingly, it is out of Western history. The year 1985 is identified by scholarship and media as the peak of Middle East terror during Reagan's War on Terror. By far the most significant acts of terror that year were the Beirut bombing, Shimon Peres's vicious Iron Fist operations, targeting terrorist villagers in Israeli-occupied Lebanon, and Israel's bombing of Tunis, murdering 75 Tunisians and Palestinians with extreme brutality, according to the report from the scene by Israeli journalist Amnon Kapeliuk. The United States assisted by refusing to inform its ally, Tunisia, that the bombers were on the way, though the Sixth Fleet certainly knew. The attack was praised by Secretary of State George Shultz, then unanimously condemned by the UN Security Council as an act of armed aggression, United States abstaining. The pretext for the bombing was retaliation for the killing of 3 Israelis in Cyprus, apparently traced to Syria. But Tunis was a defenseless and ideologically more useful target, housing the headquarters of the PLO. The Cyprus killings were in turn retaliation for regular kidnappings and killings on the high seas by Israeli naval forces, attacking ships in transit between Cyprus and northern Lebanon, with many of those captured brought to Israel and kept in prison without charge as hostages. In accord with the reigning single standard, the major terrorist atrocities, or worse, aggression, are excluded from the canon of international terrorism. The special status of 1985 as the peak year of the plague spread by depraved opponents of civilization itself is conferred by 2 events, in each of which a single American died. The most famous is the Achille Lauro hijacking, in retaliation for the Tunis bombing, during which a crippled American, Leon Klinghoffer, was brutally murdered. That was undoubtedly a shocking crime, which finds its place alongside the murder of the crippled Palestinians Kemal Zughair and Jamal Rashid by Israeli forces during their destruction of the Jenin refugee camp. Zughair was shot dead carrying a white flag as he tried to wheel himself away from Israeli tanks, which apparently drove over him, ripping his body to shreds. Rashid was crushed in his wheelchair when one of Israel's huge U.S.-supplied bulldozers demolished his home with the family inside. Thanks to prevailing moral standards, such acts are also excluded from the canon of terrorism, or worse, war crimes, by virtue of wrong agency. The Achille Lauro hijacking and Klinghoffer's murder have become the very symbol of the bestiality of Palestinian terrorism. Typical is a careful study by a member of Reagan's National Security Council staff, Michael Bone, who was director of the White House Situation Room, and therefore well informed about the events. He reviews the hijacking and Klinghoffer's murder in 200 pages of meticulous detail. The review contains a few sentences on the Tunis bombing to illustrate the complexity of the Middle East peace process, omitting all the crucial facts, such as those just mentioned. The irrational people of the Middle East, however, do not seem to share the perceptions of the world refracted through the ideological prisms of Western intellectual and moral culture, and may even fail to admire the moral clarity of its divinely guided leaders. Perhaps that has some relation to the fact that while 61% of Lebanese oppose Syrian interference in their country, 69% oppose U.S. interference. There are other divergences between Lebanese and official U.S. opinion on democracy. Attitudes toward Hezbollah are an illustration. Hezbollah has gained considerable support in Lebanon, particularly in the south, where its candidates won 80% of the vote in the June 2005 elections. In March 2005, by a vote of 380 to 3, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution condemning the continuous terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hezbollah and urging the European Union to classify Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. The Senate followed with unanimous endorsement of a similar resolution. Middle East scholar Stephen Zunes contacted scores of congressional offices, asking for examples of terrorist attacks by Hezbollah in the past decade, but no one was able to cite any. Rather than welcome Hezbollah's transformation into a political party, thus supporting Lebanese democracy, Congress preferred to follow the president's lead, continuing to punish Hezbollah for its real crime. Organized in 1982 in response to Israel's U.S.-backed invasion of Lebanon, Hezbollah drove the invader from the country. For 22 years, Israel had defied Security Council orders to withdraw, in the process carrying out many terrible atrocities with impunity, thanks to U.S. support. As Zunes comments, that virtually the entire United States Congress, including erstwhile liberal Democrats, would collude with such an agenda is yet another frightening example of how far to the right political discourse in this country has evolved. In any event, it seems safe to remove Lebanon from the canon. Let's turn to Egypt, the leading recipient of U.S. military aid after Israel, and therefore of particular concern to Americans, apart from its very significant role in the region. There have long been internal pressures for democratization in Egypt. In the past few years, the leading force in opposition to the U.S.-backed Hosni Mubarak dictatorship has been Kifaya, the popular Movement for Change. Kifaya was formed in 2000 when it challenged the country's emergency laws. It was largely sparked by the Palestinian Intifada. Its leading elements were Palestinian solidarity groups. Although such events mean little by Western standards, in Egypt and elsewhere, there were strong reactions to what took place in the occupied territories immediately after the Israeli actions that provoked the Al-Aqsa Intifada. In its first month, Israel killed 75 Palestinians, with 4 Israelis killed, in response mostly to stone-throwing, using U.S. helicopters to attack apartment complexes and other civilian targets. Clinton responded by making the biggest deal in a decade to send new military helicopters to Israel. The U.S. population was protected from that information by the press, which refused, not failed, but refused to publish it. This is not terror, or even misdeed, according to the reigning Western conventions, not shared by Egyptian democracy activists. Subsequent atrocities in the occupied territories stimulated the Egyptian reform movement further, and it was then joined by the mass opposition to the war in Iraq. The spokesperson for Kifaya, Abdel Hakim Kandil, stresses that it is an anti-imperial movement, with goals extending beyond the democratization